Johan Norberg. Thanks for coming on the Liberty Exchange podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We're here to talk about your book, Peak Human, subtitled What We Can Learn from the Rise and Fall of Golden Ages. It came out in the spring in Europe, and it's just hot off the press here in the United States. So this is a great time to be talking about its major themes.
Indeed.
The theme of the rise and fall of golden ages is a perennial one, isn't it? I mean, some historians, I'm thinking of figures like Arnold Toynbee, wrote many thousands of lines speculating about what gives rise to the growth of civilizations and what brings them down ultimately. It seems to be a preoccupation for writers and thinkers for many decades. What brought you to this topic? What did you find most interesting about this?
Well, I'm also obsessed with the decline and fall of historical civilizations. And one reason is that it's so extraordinary that places that were the cradles of civilization, suddenly it's all gone. They lose that creative spark. And you have to ask yourself, why did that happen? What was it that went wrong? But then obviously before we can ask ourselves, why did they decline and fall? The first and most interesting question is, why did they rise? Why did a place that was traditionally perhaps seen as a periphery, a poor offshoot somewhere, suddenly have this burst of scientific, technological creativity? So it's not just that we have to learn from the mistakes of the past. There's also something to be learned from what went right at certain points in time.
You chose 7 places, 7 periods to focus on, and I thought we could take each of them in turn. You have chapters on ancient Greece, on ancient Rome, the Abbasid Caliphate, Renaissance Italy, the Dutch Republic, and your concluding chapters on the Anglosphere, England and the emerging American colonies, and then the United States, of course. So let's take each of those in turn and think a little bit about what were the key ingredients that led to their rise, and what some of the critical issues were that brought them down.
Great.
In your introduction, you write that the battle between freedom and coercion and between reason and superstition is not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash within every civilization and at some level within each one of us. And I think that's a very interesting way to frame the argument that we're talking about cultures, we're talking about political societies, but we're also talking about individuals and the role they play in bringing about the golden age. So, what was the set of ideas or principles or cultural inclinations in ancient Athens that led to this tremendous flowering of culture and the arts and literature and so forth?
Yeah, there seems to be something about the classical Athenian mentality. Thucydides, the ancient historian, he talked about 2 different mindsets. It's the Athenian mentality, going out into the world, explore, learn, and acquire something new. But there's also the Spartan mentality, which is to stay at home and try to protect what you've already got. And broadly speaking, the Athenian one is more conducive to progress, to finding something new, to constantly innovate. And that's what happened in Athens, partly probably by accident originally. I think that an important reason was that they had bad soil in Athens and Attica, the rural land surrounding it. So they had to trade. They had to become a maritime civilization and get the grain they needed from the Black Sea area. And then they had to think about, so what can we produce locally instead to create this exchange? So olive trees, wine, lots of handicrafts of different sorts. And that led to Athenians constantly seeing something else. They looked at other civilizations, other cultures, other Greek city-states, and learned from them. They learned from both how to write constitutions in better or worse ways, and they also learned about how to plow the land in other ways, using new tools. And I think that turned them into more of innovators than many other Greek city-states. And obviously, they had an early version of direct democracy for free men, not for slaves and women. But that's also part of this intellectual tolerance. Anyone, any free man was allowed to speak in the assembly and had an equal share in voting afterwards. And that led to more ideas being on the table. They saw more, they could experiment more, and that made them very innovative.
Everyone is familiar with the tremendous literature and philosophy and architecture that comes out of Athens and the Athenian wealth through trade. But most people think that it really was Sparta that ruled militarily, that Sparta was the true military power that could always defeat Athens. And one of the things you remind us of is that, in fact, no. Sometimes as you say, the conservative nature of Sparta, its commitment to old practices and its closed nature, rendered it ineffectual often in the face of Athenian innovation.
Yeah, that's right, and that's surprising to lots of people, both Hollywood and many historians who read about how brave the Spartans were. They were the best fighters. And that's partly because those who wrote about Sparta back then were Athenian aristocrats who didn't like the vulgar democracy they had back in Athens. They admired the small oligarchy in Sparta that ruled and enslaved everybody else. And yes, they were pretty good fighters because they trained more, but they were also the most overrated warriors in history, partly because of this system, the authoritarian system and the system of state schools for young men meant that they were basically forced to do the same thing over and over again and repeat whatever they were doing. And in warfare, it often meant that they were very unimaginative. They tested the same thing over and over again rather than experimenting with naval warfare, siege warfare, or combined weapons maneuvers, things like that. So the Athenians were often much better because they constantly learned and adapted on the battlefield.
Yeah, fascinating. You mentioned the oligarchic disdain for the democratic nature of Athens, and I think you do a nice job of outlining various moments of tension between this oligarchic tendency and the democratic drive for participation and openness and so forth. And then ultimately, the democracy begins to crumble, and the Athens, as we know, becomes a much less open, much less prosperous place. And you write that it was at least largely due to the suffering following the Peloponnesian War. You say that it led to a deterioration of character. So here again, we have the individual, focus on the individual as somehow an important element in the decay of the city and the Athenian identity. And you say that Athens descends into a sort of fanatical tribalism. Perhaps you could say a few words about that.
Yeah. What made Athens great was this openness to new ideas from abroad and domestically. People were allowed to try new things, and I would argue that they basically invent the idea of intellectual innovation. When Aristotle says that, we should honor our friends and teachers like Plato, but also truth. And if they and we have to cherish truth even more than our friends. That's new in history. Often when people came up with new ideas, they pretended that this was an old idea that they sort of uncovered in one way or another. And that helped them in every different sphere, in architecture, in drama, in the economy. But during this long war, the Peloponnesian War against Sparta and their allies, something happens to this mentality. They become more Spartan, so to speak. They become more tribal, less openness to these new experiments and ideas. And Thucydides, the historian, talks about the deterioration of character throughout Greece. Instead of trying to look at things from different sides, learn, the hallmark of a good Athenian became being a fanatic, being a tribalist, and just sort of being a fairly ruthless character instead. And you can see that in the relationship to other Greek city-states. Once upon a time, it was based on voluntary relationships and trade. Eventually, during the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians just go and say, look, the powerful do what we can do, and the weak will suffer what they must. And that obviously led to them alienating many of their old friends, but it also led to a less open intellectual climate back home. And at the end of the Peloponnesian War, after a rough period of a brutal dictatorship as well, they even search for scapegoats and find them in Socrates, the greatest philosopher, and sentence him to death. And if even the open-minded Athenians can sour on their ideals of intellectual openness like that, it's a warning sign for every civilization, I think.
Yes. As Athens declines, we now have the rise of Rome, which is the subject of your second chapter. And you do a wonderful job of outlining the many different dimensions of Rome and the Roman Empire. One of the things that most people think of when they think of ancient Rome is conquest, military conquest, and the somewhat brutal suppression of many peoples around the Mediterranean and north into as far as Britain and so forth. But you do a very nice job of emphasizing the vast trading networks that existed in ancient Rome. And you quote a Russian historian, Michael Rostovtsev, and you say that you quote him as writing that this was a time of almost complete freedom for trade and of splendid opportunities for private initiative. You admit that perhaps he's overstating the case, but I think that that's an interesting point of departure to think about the role that Roman trading networks had in leading to its prosperity.
Yeah. Rome was probably a more market-based and a more free market, free trade entity than anything we see later in Europe until the modern era, the Enlightenment and the rise of the Industrial Revolution. And this is, the common assumption is correct. They were brutal conquerors, the Romans. They killed everyone if they opposed them. But that was not their first choice. If they could, they tried to extend alliances and to find new provinces that wanted to enter first the Republic, but it turned into an empire, and then actually left most of their institutions intact. They allowed people to keep their property, allowed them to keep their religion, often took part of some of their gods and introduced them in their own pantheon. So they gave them much power locally to keep on going as they did, and then turned this whole empire into a gigantic free trade area, connected via the Mediterranean, but also all those roads that lead to Rome, which meant that for the first time in European history, a great new idea or a new way of mixing concrete or coming up with a new form of amphora somewhere in this empire, that can then be transported, and used in the other part of, even in Brittany and places like that. So we see how you suddenly get specialization, trade, and innovation because of this melting pot of new ideas and peoples.
Yes. And is it not the case that people had the opportunity to become Roman citizens of Rome as well? So there was a sort of a sense of participation and pluralism within the context of this vast empire.
Exactly. One of the ways in which they continued to make progress was to import new brains, new talent from other places. So, as Claudius the Emperor put it, the great thing with the Roman way of conquest was that we can conquer and integrate a people on the same day. And if they're talented, they can have a career in Roman business, in the military, even in the Senate. So not that many years after Caesar has conquered the Gauls are suddenly in the Senate, and they have prominent places. Some immigrants and conquered peoples even made it to becoming emperor eventually. So it gave Rome a constant renewal of talent and of ideas, this strategic tolerance.
You point out that there have been many different theories about what contributed to Rome's decline and eventual collapse. What would you say emerged for you as the top 3 or 4 reasons that Roman civilization and the Roman Empire deteriorated?
Yeah, everybody has their own favorite, right?
Yeah.
And one German historian, he collected all the causes that have been mentioned by other historians in the 80s, and he came up with a list of more than 200, including obviously lead poisoning and barbaric invasions, but also sadness and gout.
Yes, I remember.
But to me, the most important thing that happens is that the empire is weakened from within a long time before it's then exposed to these invasions. So you have this was a decentralized empire. It's what we just talked about. Often these provinces, they governed themselves and they allowed their citizens a great degree of freedom, which meant that you had many different sources of economic productivity, of technological innovation, but also of raising men for the army and so on. So there were many options. Even though one province might be in a bad, sad state, there were others that could sort of fill in the gaps. What happened in the 3rd century and onwards was that the emperors became more like military dictators, rather than once upon a time they might have pretended that they were just senators, which was a good fake because it allowed, at least forced them to sort of abide by some of the laws and the individual rights of others. But now they pretended to be gods. They began to centralize power completely in the capital, which meant that they now had a single point of failure. If they failed there wasn't enough of power, resources, freedoms locally to fill in those gaps. So that's why I think that the Roman Empire fell like a bankruptcy described by Ernest Hemingway. It collapsed in 2 ways. First gradually, and then suddenly.
Yes. Yeah. This element of trade that was characteristic of the Roman Empire is what you showcase in your 3rd chapter about the Abbasid Caliphate. This was predominantly located in North Africa and the Middle East. Perhaps you could say a few words about its cultural practices and what led to its tremendous prosperity. Was it like Rome, just very extensive trade networks? Were there other factors that led to the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate?
I think it's partly that they imitate Rome. I'd say the ancient classical Rome at its peak. More than the Byzantine, Eastern Roman Empire did. That became much more centralized, whereas the Abbasids, they were connecting these areas from North Africa to Central Asia under one system of law and rights, Islamic law, and also free trade. And traders, merchants, had actually a better position in this caliphate than it did in ancient Athens and Rome. While they had engaged in trade and commerce, they always thought that this was something for foreigners and slaves, because it's not really dignified. The sign of a really good man is that he makes war, not money. The Abbasids and the Arabs during this era, they thought that being a merchant and making money, it's something that's highly respectable, and as Muhammad, a prophet who was a merchant himself, said that the honest merchants belong with the prophets. That's a really dignified trade. So that helped. But also, there was something about creating this brand new empire over such a large area in the 8th, 9th century that forced them to think about, so how do we administer this? How do we deal with calculations? How do we codify the law? So they needed scholars and they needed ideas from elsewhere, and they knew that they had to borrow them from other places. So they translated Greek books, they invited scholars and scientists from all the way from India and Christians and Jews, and allow them all to speak freely and to even sponsor their work in various ways. So they became very intellectually open-minded, in sharp contrast to most Muslim states today. They thought that shutting out facts and research, even when they come from other faiths, that's a way to block out the kingdom of God, basically, because we stop learning about the world, and that helped them to acquire scientific knowledge and technological capacity to a degree that was incredibly impressive to Europe back in those times. And, we still have it in our language. We don't have to go further than A to think about things we got from the Arabs back then: arithmetic, algebra, algorithm, Arabic numerals.
Yes, yeah. In your summary, you point to many of these themes in a very succinct way. You write, "The Abbasid Caliphate is a fascinating corrective against the idea that some faiths are doomed to intolerance and superstition. While many present-day Islamic states are oppressive and underdeveloped, the Caliphate was the world's richest and most advanced culture, while Europe was still in its dark ages. It's not the religion itself that decides the outcome, but how it is interpreted and what is emphasized. In 8th century Baghdad, it was interpreted as the way to peace, openness, and progress."
And that's also why Europe saw Islam as its teacher back then. The European scholars who wanted to learn, they tried to get their hands on Avicenna's books or Averroes' books, because that was the greatest extent of knowledge back in those times. But also traders, merchants, they learned from the early forms of financial capitalism in Renaissance Italy eventually was something that they learned by trading with the Arabs.
Yeah. So after the Abbasid Caliphate, Johan, you go on to discuss Song China. Perhaps you could just outline what was going on culturally, what was going on economically that resulted in just the tremendous wealth and prosperity of that region.
Yeah, China at this time, we're now in the 10th, 11th, 12th century, was taking over the position from the Abbasids as the leading civilization on the planet. After a long period of civil strife and conflicts in China, the Song dynasty takes power, but they do it in a different way than they had the rulers usually had. They try to have a variant of feudalism where people were tied to the land, forced to hand over goods in kind to the rulers, and it was a very centralized system. The Song dynasty didn't. They had a volunteer army, perhaps because it was difficult to tie people to the land during this conflict area. And that changed so many things. So many things followed from this, because if you don't have this forced labor, if you don't force families to work on a specific piece of land, instead you raise an army through taxes. So the Song dynasty understood that to do that, we have to encourage commerce, mobility, urbanization. To encourage farmers to farm a particular plot of land, let's hand them property rights to that land instead. And this started a process where farmers began to experiment with new crops, new forms of irrigation, new forms of rice from Vietnam, making tea, turning it from a luxury good to everyday low prices, so that we now always think of tea when we talk about tea and rice, when we talk about China. But also this led to large-scale urbanization, people moving to cities, and there almost spontaneously beginning to undermine the old walls that separated classes and controlled markets, and turning it into basically all around the clock market cities that were bustling with energy and commerce. And of course they had paper money. They had come up with that invention, probably tea merchants who came up with it, and that helped them to commercialize not just the cities, but the countryside as well. So they became incredibly wealthy, and the population surged, so that China, well, the start of the biggest population on the planet.
You attribute the fall of Song China to, in part at least, the invading Mongols. And this has some parallel with the negative effects of the Peloponnesian War for the Athenians. Were there other factors at play in the decline of Song China?
Yeah, I once learned from the great libertarian scholar Tom Palmer that there's a lesson from history, and that's don't be invaded by Mongols, because that often sets bad things in motion. And what happened then was, the Mongols, and Kublai Khan, when he took over China, he wanted to keep all that wealth intact and all that science because he enjoyed it. He thought this was great, but he didn't have this understanding for the institutions that it took, the intellectual openness and the free markets. So step by step, it began to undermine it through warlordism and a return to more feudal relationships. But then what really was the end of this era of Chinese greatness was that the next dynasty that took over, the Ming dynasty in the 14th century, they portrayed themselves as a return to stability and also return to a more sort of domestic rule, because they associated now whatever had happened before and the cosmopolitanism of the Song dynasty with the invading Mongols. So they thought that now let's try to reduce all the exchange with the rest of the world, to the extent that they banned ocean-going travel. They even banned international trade eventually, and instead of commercial relationships, tried to instead impose a command and control system that really kept people in place with the same old technologies and the same old ways of producing as they've always had. And they got stability, for sure, but also stagnation for some 500 years, turning the richest country on the planet into a desperately poor one.
Yes, recalling some of the lessons from Sparta. Yeah. Let's move to Renaissance Italy. You discuss many different contributing factors to the incredible rise of the Italian city-states in the Renaissance period. You discuss the codification of law as an important element. You point to decentralization as another important aspect of Renaissance prosperity. The rise of the merchant class. Perhaps you could say a few words about that interesting dynamic and how it led to the creation of a place that we all still love to travel to experience the art and the beautiful architecture.
Yeah, it's a remarkable era in European history, for sure. And it happened in those Italian small trading cities that had acquired independence somewhere between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope, who both wanted complete control. There were, through their rivalry, there were gaps where some cities and some universities could acquire independence. And they did, and they traded, and they learned from the Arabs, from the Chinese, that something better could be done. And they also dug in their own history, finding Roman and Greek texts, art, sculpture, and that also created this boost of energy. With more commerce, with more trade, they became fabulously wealthy. They became rich. They began to undermine the traditional systems of serfdom in Italy, and instead having commercial relationships and more of individual rights. And in such a system where you have this social mobility, where people suddenly rise, not through their family name and their ancestors, but through their own hard work. You begin to change perceptions, identities, and you begin to talk about yourself in new ways. And this is probably what the historians call the birth of the individual. You start to think of yourself as an individual and not just as part of this great chain of being. And how can you prove yourself then in this context, if not in any better way than sponsoring Michelangelo to do a great sculpture or to ask Leonardo da Vinci to paint your portrait? So there is this connection between art and capitalism in Italy in the 14th, 15th century. Experiments in art as well, but also new forms of sponsorship by merchants who might pay for a fresco in a particular church somewhere. And this creates rivalry between the artists as well. Famously, Michelangelo said that Leonardo da Vinci was a hopeless procrastinator who never finishes his works. And Leonardo retorted that all those muscular figures of Michelangelo, they don't look like muscles, they look like sacks of walnuts. And I think they both had a point. But more importantly, that rivalry pushed them to create even greater works that we still admire today in Florence, in Rome, and in those great cities.
It's interesting how financial prosperity and the rise of markets and trade almost inevitably seems to lead to a flowering in the arts and literature and other related fields.
Yeah, that's right. And first of all, you need some prosperity in order to engage in the arts, because if you're at subsistence level, you need all hands in agriculture. So you need some wealth and some division of labor so that they can produce so much food that you can afford to have some guys doing paintings or writing history books or what have you. So that's important in itself. But also there's something about this climate of constant experimentation and innovation, which works both in economics and in the arts. You're allowed to test new things, to try using colors to convey perspective for the first time in 800 years. It's like society gives permission to do that. And then obviously if people... there is conspicuous consumption in the arts in Renaissance Italy and in many later prosperous places, because people want to acquire and do something new and also to be seen to acquire some great new art.
Now, you mentioned a number of different things to account for the decline of Renaissance Italy, but one of them is this decreasing tolerance and perhaps an overreaction to the Reformation, which on one hand could be seen as a liberation, could be seen as a drive for freedom from the Catholic Church. But the response to the Reformation had very negative consequences for Renaissance Italy and elsewhere. Perhaps you could say a few words about that.
That's right. The Protestant Reformation probably had an important effect of unleashing more individualist attitudes in the long run, because it liberated people from church hierarchies. You have your own relationship with God. But the first Protestant churches weren't individualist or liberal in any kind of sense of the word. Instead, they had state-church alliances and wanted complete orthodoxies where they were, and started to persecute dissidents and dissident scientists as well, a long time before the Catholic Church did. But this rivalry between the churches created this era of competing fanaticism, as Steve Davis puts it, the historian, because then the Catholic Church wanted to step up its own oppression. They had previously sponsored many of the Renaissance humanists, and they had often published their works, and they were allowed to paint in the Sistine Chapel in Rome and so on. But now with this threat, and there's something that happens when your intellectual power base is eroded. There's this turn inward. You want to centralize, create a much more strict hierarchy and orthodoxy and begin to persecute dissidents as well. So after the Protestants had said that Copernicus came with dangerous ideas about the sun being the center, not the earth, then the Catholic Church suddenly said, yeah, we agree. We're also going to persecute ideas like that and have Galileo stand for trial and threatened with torture if he didn't recant. And all those artists that they had formerly sponsored, now they were often banned. Many of the books were burnt, and suddenly we go from an era of remarkable Renaissance openness into an era where those who think the most freely, they end up on the stake.
You have a chapter on the Dutch Republic, and similar forces are at work there. Tension between empire and military conquest and a spirit of openness. And I think that's very interesting. You quote Spinoza, who writes that in this flourishing state, the Dutch Republic, this city, without a peer, men of every race and sect live in greatest harmony. And there was no tension between people. People didn't care about their religious affiliation or their sect. I'm paraphrasing, but that really does characterize many aspects of the Netherlands at the time. Were there other elements at play that allowed for this tremendous wealth and diversity of thought in that?
Yeah, I think the Dutch Republic is the most fascinating story in at least some kind of modern history, and I think they became so prosperous and the leaders of the world in a short period of time. This tiny northwestern periphery of Europe, they didn't have anything. No state church, no royalty, not even a centralized state, just the different cities and provinces that fought with one another. They didn't even have land on which to stand and grow their food, because it was taken away by the ocean. But that's precisely what made them innovative. They had to, just like the Athenians had to go abroad because their soil was bad. The Dutch realized early on that, look, in order to prosper, we need to trade. So we do what we can on this land, so more cattle, cheese, and textile trade and things like that. And in exchange, we buy the grain we need from the Baltic region. And this made them incredibly wealthy. There's a great quote by an English observer at this time who was stunned because this Dutch land isn't sufficient to provide people with any kind of goods, and yet they have more of all these sorts of goods than anybody else, precisely because of commerce and specialization. And they also had to fill this land with people. They were few, so they opened their doors to dissidents, Jews from Portugal and Spain, people fleeing the German religious wars, Huguenots from France and other places. But even, Catholics like Descartes, the philosopher who made it from France to the Dutch Republic in order to speak and publish freely. So it became this tolerant place where people were allowed to experiment in business and in ideas, and that led them to being the richest country on the planet. And what's most surprising is they did this while they were under attack by the greatest empire on the planet, the Spanish Habsburg Empire. And they sought their independence from them and fought against the Spanish for 80 years. And everybody expected Spain to win because they had everything. They had the state church, they had the armies, the land, they even had the colonies in America and in the Philippines. And yet at the end of it all, Spain had declared state bankruptcy some 5 times, whereas the Dutch merchants, they had become more prosperous than anybody else.
Yeah, it's an amazing account of building something on virtually nothing. It's perhaps analogous in some ways to Hong Kong in the 20th century, a city that can become incredibly prosperous with so little, at least so little that is evident at first glance. But
and just like Hong Kong, it really was a great corrective against the standard thought of the day, that you needed natural resources, you needed lots of land in order to prosper. But once people saw that the Dutch Republic became so fabulously rich, and Hong Kong did, that changes perceptions. Okay, it's not about how much you've got, it's how you think, how you become productive, how you trade.
And that dynamic is everywhere apparent in your final chapter that you called the Anglosphere. There's an interesting marriage of this spirit of innovation and the willingness to take the innovation and apply it technologically to trade and leverage technology to just achieve the most remarkable economic growth. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about the Anglosphere and how some of these values contributed to the rise of Britain and the United States.
Yeah. Partly Britain becomes so important to this story because they borrow Dutch ideas. And they do because they are invaded by the Dutch in 1688. When the Dutch are desperate, they fear a new English-French alliance against them. And their only way out is trying to conquer England. And they do in 1688, and is rapidly rebranded as a glorious revolution. And that's partly because the Whig parliamentary constitutional forces in England, they really welcome this invasion by William of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder, who becomes the English, and eventually then the British king. And many of these ideas that we associate with the Dutch become British ideas, of more of rule of law, constitutional division of powers, and also the free market and free trade system. And this is the important background to the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution in Britain after the union between England and Scotland, because suddenly you have this sense that you're allowed to test new technologies and new business models that are more productive, even though people might lose their jobs in old ones. This is something that the rulers in most places have blocked until then. But for the first time now, the British authorities, they are on the side of the innovators and protect their innovations and their patents as well. Whereas the French and the Dutch, they had a patent system, but you had to go to a bureaucrat who would have to decide that this is an important invention and we need this invention. So you had to test it. It was state tested, not market tested. Whereas the British protected any invention, whether the bureaucrats liked it or not. You generally had the breaking down of the old guild system that had stopped new forms of division of powers and a division of labor, and in the introduction of new workers into certain industries. So tremendous sources of entrepreneurship and innovation. Once you combine that with the science of the day, all those scientists who meet entrepreneurs in the coffee shops all over Britain, they come up with better ways of mining, better machine tools, coming up with steam powers. So for the first time in human history, we don't have to rely on muscle power and animals to get anything done. We can employ fossil fuels, coal, steam, in order to acquire more power, capacity, productive potential. And this is the path to prosperity for the modern world. This is how we finally, after this long journey, begin to put food on the table of normal people.
In a sense, we're still living in the golden age of the Anglosphere, and we have been enjoying just tremendous prosperity, and that prosperity has spread to many parts of the world, and we have a tremendously global trade now, and many countries with increasing openness. But every once in a while, one senses cracks or one senses threats. What do you think the threats are to our current golden age? How can we guard against the fall of this golden age? How can we ensure that we have peak human into the future for many, many decades, many centuries?
Yeah, this is indeed a golden age. And for the first time, it's not limited to one specific region, but the spread of markets and of trade and of digital technology means that we have a high level of knowledge and capacity all over the world. And that's the reason why we've seen the greatest economic and social progress the world has ever seen in this golden era. So it's worth protecting. But it's always at risk. It's always at risk for several reasons. One of them being that once we've made great progress, we tend to take it for granted. And instead, we just demand instant gratification and consumption rather than thinking about all the production of wealth and of technology that it takes. But also, we have this repeated glitch within our human nature that once we become fearful of the world, once we begin to think that the world is dangerous, we think that we can protect ourselves by turning to a strong man, a big government, try to create centralized stability in certain ways, and then push back against trade and migration and of capitalism, the very sources of strength and constant renewal. So the first way to protect a golden age is to identify what it's about, what are the institutions that made this possible, and then to argue and to talk about it and wage this battle of ideas, because this is something that I've learned from history. We have many worrying signs today, geopolitical tensions and the rise of authoritarianism in many places, pushback against trade and so on. But all these golden ages faced lots of trouble during their whole existence, but that didn't necessarily result in a decline and fall. Sometimes they managed to bounce back, but that was often the result of a protection of certain institutions and a battle, often a battle of ideas, of mentalities, whether they retreated into a more Spartan protectionist mindset or wanted to be more Athenian and keep pushing. So that's my main message from this book. If you like this golden age, you'd better fight for it, because that's the one thing we can do to try to extend the lifespan of this civilization.
Well, that's a wonderful way to leave it. Johan, thank you so much for talking with us at the Liberty Exchange.
Thank you.